Okay, we're going to talk about conditional statements, and you probably are familiar with them. It's basically like a cause and effect solution here. So in other words, you have like if P, then Q. And we're using little letters here to represent statements. Statements could be something as simple as, if I have a watch, then I know the time. And so it's an if-then statement. I have a watch would be P, then I know the time would be Q. And so we sometimes abbreviate them with letters. In symbolic form or mathematical form, we write this as P, and then we write a little arrow meaning Q, meaning P results in Q. That's what this means. And so again, a conditional statement is always if-then because it's a condition based on something else. You probably know this in science as a hypothesis and a conclusion. Okay, whatever comes after the if portion or the P is called the hypothesis. So I have a watch would be the hypothesis, and the conclusion would be then I know the time. Okay, so that's how this works here with conditional statements. You'll see many of them coming up here. So let's go through an example here. The one I give on my site is, if I have a conditional, it says, if you study for the test, then you will perform well. Well, suppose you study, the hypothesis would be, again, what comes after the if portion, and so it would be study for the test, and the conclusion would be, well, then I perform well. Sometimes they're harder to spot, like this one. Your body will explode if you eat Mentos and Diet Coke. In this one, the if portion comes later, but realize that this is still the hypothesis. In other words, if I eat Mentos and Diet Coke, what will happen? What will result in? Well, my belly will explode. You don't test that, by the way, and also it's not true. But so that would be the conclusion there. The next one there, green potatoes make you sick. Well, there is no if statement. However, you have to look at the result. The result is getting sick, okay? And the cause is eating green potatoes. So what you could write here is, well, the hypothesis is eating green potatoes, and the result is I will get sick. And so you have to kind of read between the lines. It's often useful to rewrite these. So in other words, instead of writing green potatoes make you sick, you could have written, if you eat green potatoes, then you will get sick. And then it's an if-then statement. It's easier to spot. We can have variations of this. And one thing to note here is that sometimes we have this symbol which is not. In other words, you're negating something. Okay? When you negate something, you take the negative of it. So suppose our initial statement is, if a student studies, then they will get good grades. That's our statement. Well, a converse of that statement is when you switch them. So instead of saying P then Q, we're going to say Q then P. And so in other words, if a student gets good grades, then they will study. Okay? It's just flipping it. It's taking the converse of it. The inverse is taking the original statement, but taking the negative of each. So in other words, you're taking the negative of each. So if a student does not study, then they will not get good grades. And so that's the inverse. So you have a converse, we have an inverse, and the last thing is something called a contrapositive, which is kind of like taking the inverse of the converse or the converse of the inverse. In other words, you're doing both. So you're flipping it, you're now making Q then P and taking the negative. So if a student does not get good grades, then they will not study. So you're flipping both. Now these statements can be true or false, and it depends. It's a little tricky to find out if they are true or false, but let's find out and read a little more here. Determining the truth value, okay? The only time that a conditional statement is false is if the first part is true and the second part is false. This seems kind of weird, but let me explain this. So suppose I had a statement that says, if I study, then I get good grades. Well, suppose you studied, so that's a true statement, you studied, and all of a sudden you got good grades. Wouldn't this statement right here be true? That is true, because I studied and I got good grades. But what if you studied, which is true, but you didn't get good grades? Then this conditional statement is false. In other words, you did what you should have done, but the result didn't happen. Now the weird thing happens is if you don't do it. In other words, if you do not study, okay, so in other words, this part is false, I didn't study, well then it doesn't matter what happens. Because as soon as you don't study, you can't prove anything. Because you may get good grades or you may not. Maybe you cheated, maybe you did something else. We don't know. But the fact of the matter is you can't tell. So by default, this statement is still true until we can prove that when I do what I'm supposed to and I don't get the conclusion, then it's false. Otherwise, by default, it is true.